addressed. But, we've had election observers on the field following this election, both from Nigeria and outside of the country, foreign observers as well. And we have one of them with us here in the studio. He's going to tell us some of the things he's observed. He's Barry Andrews. He's a member of the European Parliament for Dublin. He's also the chief observer, European Union Election Observation Mission to Nigeria. Good to have you join us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's an amazing time for Nigerians, and we're glad that we have quite a number of foreign observers monitoring this election. It's perhaps the highest contingent that we've had in the history of elections in this country. But you look at the figures too. We have a high volume of voter register. INEC is saying that registered voters in Nigeria is more than all of the registered voters in West Africa. So this exercises, you're holding election in West Africa and some parts of Central Africa. How significant is this for the continent and indeed the world at this time?
Well, it's a great point, and many people I've spoken to have raised this issue. That is that Nigerian democracy is important to Nigerians principally, but it is really important for the region, for all of West Africa and for the African continent. And that's why the European Union invests so much time and expertise into the election monitoring exercise. We're here at the invitation of INEC. We're here to make an assessment based on the criteria that Nigeria sets for itself through international covenants and its own legislation. So it's a very good relationship, and we have made recommendations and conclusions in previous elections, in fact in each of the presidential elections since the return to democracy in 1999. So we've developed, I think, a relationship of trust, and what criticism we make is made in a spirit of constructive relationships and trying to deepen the roots of Nigerian democracy.
And we expect to see some of those criticisms, because we know that you are going to produce a preliminary report in 2 days' time, and then the final report will come 3 months' time. But you were at a polling unit today in Wuse, if I'm correct. What was your experience like?
Well, yes, we were at I personally was at polling units this morning in Abuja and this afternoon. We have 100 observers across the country in each of the 36 states, and we have been here since early January. So, what's happening today is, of course, of critical importance, but this is an entire process that we're looking at. So we've been observing the entire election process from the legislation, the judiciary, the media, every aspect of it, security, the operation of technology, and we'll stay here for the governorship elections on the 11th of March, and we'll stay into late April in order to finalise the final report that you mentioned, which will contain the conclusions and recommendations of this mission. So it's a very detailed project. It's not just about the polling day itself.
Talk to us about the standards and international conventions by which Nigeria's performance will be measured with as regards to this election.
Yeah, so I think the shorthand is we looked for inclusivity, transparency and credibility. So in terms of inclusivity, we're looking at whether or not there is the ability to run for election, including for minority groups and also for women. We look at the question of transparency, which is whether or not the Electoral Act is fully observed and implemented. We look at the question of credibility. So the security situation comes into that. But each of these criteria are contained, as you say, in international conventions that Nigeria has already signed up to. So it's not as if we're bringing in some standards that Nigeria isn't already settled as wanting to adhere to. These are standards that have already been set. And we follow a methodology as a mission, which it has stood the test of time. As I said, we've been here each time in Nigeria, but we've done this in countries across the world for the last 30 or 40 years.
And just because you mentioned you've done this for countries in the world, and we know that you would have that report out, in a preliminary report out in just a few days after the election. But are you going to stay, will your report also extend till after the election, after results have been collated? And then what do you think in terms of comparison between our electoral process, where we are now today, and probably maybe the rest of Africa?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, but certainly we are going to stay here past the governorship elections, and if there's a second round on the presidential, we'll stay for that, and then we will continue to finalise our work into early April, and then within 3 months after the end of the election, we'll do a final report with conclusions and recommendations. But we don't compare elections. We just look at it from in and of itself, based on the observation that we received from our long-term observers on the ground and the short-term observers that were deployed during the course of this week, and the work of our experts. We have an election technology expert, we have social media experts, we have legal experts, and they are providing us with the kind of insights that will allow us, I think, to produce a constructive report for the people of Nigeria.
We have seen you have consultations and meetings across the board, particularly with chief observers of African Union and ECOWAS, Thabo Mbeki, former president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta. A lot has been said about the need for foreign observers to be neutral and not interfere in the electoral process. How well would you say you have performed? Because you said you've been monitoring this election since 1999.
That's a great question. There's a few people outside the studio who are watching me very carefully to make sure that I don't say anything that could be perceived as interference in the election process. So I think that's why we have such a good relationship. It's why we were invited back all the time. And as I say, I met one of the one of the election commissioners in Lagos, and he told me that he had been in my country observing my presidential elections in Europe, and so it's a relationship of mutual respect based on the standards that we've all adhered to, and I think that's why we're asked to come back time and time again.
And I know you said you don't compare, so you won't compare countries within Africa, but at least you can compare Nigeria to Nigeria, because you have been here since 1999. You've always sent foreign observers to Nigeria since 1999. When you look at where we are coming from, what would you say about the recommendations made by past EU missions to Nigeria?
Yeah. So in 2019, we did exactly the same thing. We did a preliminary report a couple of days after the election, and then we did a final report within 3 months after the election. But 3 years later, so that is just a year ago, in 2022, we came back and did an electoral follow-up mission. And we sort of x-rayed the recommendations that we had made to see extent of implementation. And what we found was that 13 of the recommendations we had made were implemented or partially implemented.
Out of how many?
Out of 30, I should have said.
Out of 30.
Out of 30. So 13 out of 30 were already fully implemented or partially implemented. And of the remainder, some of efforts had been made or discussions were ongoing. For example, women's participation in politics is an issue that was brought up before, and an effort was, a bill was put before the House before it was rejected by both chambers. So that's not implemented, but efforts were made in that regard. So overall, I think it underlines that we are listened to. When we come here, we've had excellent engagement with all stakeholders, media, civil society, the political participants themselves, and the judiciary. And so we should be able to add some value in this really, really important day.
Did you?
Sorry.
Yes.
Right.
Did you get a feedback as to the 17 other recommendations that were not implemented?
Yeah, so this is an exercise that we carry out ourselves, and it's in the public domain. We published this follow-up report, and we were able to give an assessment. So there are some of those 17 where we would not describe it as implemented or partially implemented, but some discussions are ongoing with the authorities on those, among the authorities, not with us, of course. We're simply external to the entire process, but certainly there are discussions going on in the overall Nigerian political system to try and advance some of those. So it's, we are careful to follow up on our missions and to examine whether or not we are having an impact.
I was going to ask earlier if you've had any cause to change your recommendations, because now you see that the situation in Nigeria today is not the same situation in Nigeria in 2019 election. The conversation today is slightly different. We're talking about the BVAS today. 2019 we were talking about card readers. So do you have any cause to change your recommendations as you monitor elections?
Well, the recommendations will come out at the end of the process. That is 3 months before after the end of the election. So that's sometime in April or May. We'll produce that final report, and that recommendation will be based on all of our observations from early January all the way through. As I mentioned before, we won't compare with previous situations with card readers, but we will have regard to the operation of BVAS, how it's operated, how the Electoral Act is being implemented, and INEC's powers. And we have a data analyst who's working, gathering information today. We have an election technology analyst who's going to examine all of the technology behind BVAS and how it operates. And ultimately that will lead into the kind of recommendations we will make for the future, and hopefully it'll be as well received as previously.
We hear that you have close to 100 observers in Nigeria, and they've been here since January. Talk to us about the quality of collaboration you're getting with other critical stakeholders, making your job easy as you observe this poll.
Yeah, we think we have a long-term approach to all of this. So it's not just about what happens on election day. And we have found that stakeholders have had an open door for us. We have been able to speak with civil society throughout Nigeria. We've been able to have conversations with key political participants, with church leaders, with the judiciary, with the media, and that has led to a very productive reporting into our headquarters in Abuja. But it's premature for us to draw any conclusions right now. What's happening today, of course, is the critical event. Indeed. And I think that it's, at the polling units that I was at this morning, it was really extraordinary to see people turning up. And our key message really is we want to see a peaceful day today. We want people to be able to exercise their political right to vote unhindered, to be able to exercise their franchise. And so we'll provide our assessment in a couple of days' time.
And beyond interacting with stakeholders, do you interact with Nigerians as well? And what are you hearing from them?
Yes, well, in the polling units this morning, I took time to speak to voters who were queuing up and trying to exercise their political right to vote. And it's very hard to draw conclusions from specific input that you're getting from individuals standing in the queue. So what we're looking for is patterns. We're looking to see, not to look at isolated incidents and to build something more out of it than is the case. We're looking at the situation across the country. We're looking at any issues that are arising. If we can see them happening in common across different states, then this becomes relevant to the kind of report that we produce in due course. But yes, we've had conversations with ordinary Nigerians, and ultimately we're here because we want to help ordinary Nigerians to be able to be proud of their democratic system, be proud of the key role that they play in the region, and really have a future for so many young people here in Nigeria.
So I see that you're holding the details of your observation close to your chest. I understand that there's a formal report that is expected 2 days after the election and a more robust report in 3 months' time. But you have studied the Electoral Act because this is the first election we're having after an improved law. Talk to us about the things the conversations you've had as regards to this law with stakeholders and some of the observations you've made.
Yeah, well, as with any electoral system, the regulatory environment is absolutely critical. And obviously INEC have the central key role here in the full implementation of the Electoral Act. And I think it's widely accepted that it has improved public confidence in the electoral process. But nevertheless, we will examine it in the same way as we're examining all the other moving parts of the electoral process here in Nigeria, and we will let that become part of the preliminary statement. I don't mean to frustrate the questions that you're asking, but naturally we have to gather the whole picture before we share our findings. And as I say, on Monday, this will be a preliminary statement. We will share that with the public, and we will hold a press conference and answer any questions that you have on that day, and hopefully provide you a little bit more detail than I'm able to provide today.
But if I understand you correctly, your recommendation will also include the Electoral Act and not just the electoral process itself.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that is if we conclude that there are reforms that are required under the Electoral Act. We would, in previous occasions, have looked at recommendations that require constitutional change, recommendations that require administrative changes, and some that require legislative changes. So the Electoral Act obviously falls into that category, but that's not to say that we're going to make any recommendations about reform of the Electoral Act. We may well do so, and we will. What happens today is so important to all of that. The technology, the security, and then what happens later if certain cases are taken in the courts, if litigation follows. A lot of that will be interpretation of the Electoral Act. So it would be premature to draw any conclusions right now. And I think really the final report will be the key one in respect of the operation of the Electoral Act.
Well, it's a history-making event in Nigeria, our 7th successive general election, and we're kind of excited about it. Barrick Andrews, member of the European Parliament for Dublin and chief observer of the European Union Election Observation Mission to Nigeria. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for talking to us.
All right.